Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast third season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. It's an amazing episode with Marc Bernardin boards the mothership, talk Mace Windu from Marvel Comics. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for coming to the Versus Stars podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's really my pleasure, sir. Thank you so much. I'm enjoying Star Wars Mace Windu, and thank you so much for doing it.
Excellent. No, it's been a blast, man.
So I would start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics and who your earliest influences?
What inspired my love for comics? Specifically, I'd have to put this at the feet of my dad, who bought me my first like brown paper bag full of comics on his way home from work one day when I was like 11 or 12 years old. And it was also a bunch of comics that I should not have been reading. I think at the top of that list was like Savage Sword of Conan,
Mm.
which this old black and white digest that Marvel used to put out with like Ernie Chan and Roy Thomas um those were bloody and violent and there was like nudity in them, and I'm 11 and it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And dad didn't know any better, which is exactly what you want your dad to be like if he's funneling you content at a young age. He's like, well, it's a comic book. um so that was my first real exposure. Like my mom had tried earlier, like she bought me like back in the because I'm an old man, back in the 70s. DC used to do this thing where they put comic books in supermarkets. They
Mm.
just like polybag like 5 or 6 books that like, all right, here's whatever, Superman, here's a Green Lantern, here's a the Aquaman thing. And maybe kid will like it, maybe they won't, I don't know. And it just never clicked for me. It was all just too weird and disparate, and like, what
Mm.
am I, are these connected or are they not? Like, I without anybody to tell me how to read a comic book, I couldn't quite figure it out at like
Right,
7
right.
years old. But it wasn't until the blood and violence and gore sort of got me in. Um, and then like the first comics that I bought myself were the Secret Wars,
Mm.
the sort of Jim Shooter brainchild to try to get people to buy comic books in the mid 80s. And they worked. Like you put every character in the Marvel universe in the same comic book and you have them doing cool shit, then like, yeah, no, I'll buy that. I bought all 12 of those. And that was my sort of crash course introduction to the Marvel universe. And that led me down the path of Spider-Man and the X-Men and the Avengers to a lesser degree. And those were my standbys for a while because I also grew up in New York and the
Mm.
Marvel universe was New York.
Mm.
And so there's something really interesting about being like, I could go to like the Baxter building right now. I could go and find the Sanctum Sanctorum. Hey, it's in the West Village. Let's go. Like, where's Hell's Kitchen? The subway lets you out there. Let's go find Daredevil. And so like that was really, really appealing, especially as a New York kid. Whereas, the DC universe was Metropolis and Gotham, which are both New York, but weird.
Yeah.
Um, but it wasn't until like Watchmen came out and Dark Knight Returns, that sort of I began to explore DC Comics. But yeah, no, it started for me with the MCU, with Conan and Spider-Man and the X-Men.
Did you hold on to those comics?
No, no. I have some of the Savage Swords. I have some of that run that I then bought. But all of those, early Spideys. I think I even had like McFarlane's first Web of Spider-Man. That it's either in a long box buried somewhere in my garage being eaten by rabbits, or it has been flushed down the tubes of history by the
Oh.
ceremonial mom getting rid of stuff she doesn't know she shouldn't get rid of when you go to college.
So, now that you're writing Star Wars Mace Windu, were you also a Star Wars fan? Because once again, if you're buying comics in the 70s, Star Wars 1977, that's right at the heart of your age group.
Absolutely. No, I saw Star Wars first run, like theatrically in 77, or probably more likely 78. Because Star Wars was in theaters for about a year and a half because it was doing so well. Yeah, no, it is a very, very formative memory for me, sitting in the theater and watching a Star Destroyer scream over your head and like reading those big blue words. And like all of it is still very, very important to me as both a nerd and as a storyteller. Yeah, Star Wars is mother's milk. And so and the thing about Star Wars, especially if you were of that age when it came out, you really had to work to be a fan of Star Wars. because you had to sustain your love in the absence of reaffirmations of that love. Like you could get some action figures eventually, and you might be able to get some underoos, and there's a bed set where you can get like sheets and a blanket and curtains for your room, but there was no other Star Wars content. There was a couple of novels early on, but the flood of stuff that you have these days, the overwhelming torrent of Star Wars content you could have if you're a 12-year-old now, like you could happily just, pop a vein and just ingest it for years and not
Yeah.
hit the bottom of it. And so, I was as deep a Star Wars fan as you could be at that time. Like I read the comics, I read the Marvel books that they put out, I read, Splinter in the Mind's Eye, and all of that stuff. And so it was very, very real to me. And it had never been possible, I guess, to fall in love with a thing that you couldn't have anymore. It's like, wait, you mean we're done? The Return of the Jedi is it? Like, it seems like there were more of these. Why are there not more of these?
I was just going to ask if you were buying the comic books. Did you get as far as the 90s with the EU books with Timothy Zahn and Kevin Anderson writing their books, their novels?
I never did. I never did because I think that what ended up happening was for me, Star Wars was a thing in the rearview mirror
Hmm.
for a while. The video games I would occasionally kind of engage with, but the novels and the comics and all that stuff was just like, oh well, I'm glad that they're here because if you're this person now and you're coming to Star Wars as a 12 or 13-year-old now, then like by all means go for it. But I just never did. Star Wars for me has very much been about the movie experience.
So,
That to me is what Star Wars is.
so no love for the Ewok movies that came out in the 80s.
No, no, not so much. Not so much for the Life Day special. Not so much for for the droid show. No, I was a mainline kid.
So, fast forwarding to Star Wars Mace Windu, which is what you're writing.
Mhm.
When you're thinking about writing Star Wars now, as opposed to maybe even when you're writing when people are writing the novels in the 90s or it's the comic books from Marvel in the 80s, you're dealing with a ton of continuity. I mean,
Yes.
it's a huge level of continuity. There's also a question of what is in continuity, which canon from the EU books, was canon right after the prequels, but before the sequels came out.
Mhm.
So, how are you navigating all of that to determine what counts for you as being canon and what is your Mace Windu?
Um, it sort of began. Mace my Mace Windu is Sam Jackson. And so the first bellwether is if you're writing dialogue and it doesn't sound like Sam Jackson could say it, you've written the dialogue wrong. And that's even going like my Mace Windu is a younger Mace Windu than is in the prequels. He's not a kid, but this is like, it is for me like the second James Bond movie, right?
Mm.
Like he's already got his 00 license. Now he's still a little green behind the ears, but he's off in the world doing things. Like that's what this was for me. And as for what's canon and what's not canon, I just leaned heavily on Lucasfilm, on the Lucasfilm licensing group, who would kind of happily tell me it's like, oh no, we're not considering this canon. There was a whole thing where um I think it's an issue too, where we establish that Azita Cruz, the smuggler we meet, is from the same home world as Mace Windu is. And so I had this whole idea based on some of that EU canon was that this was a planet of Jedi's.
Mm.
Like everybody on this planet is strong with the Force. Like it had been settled initially by a Jedi sort of generation cruiser or whatever that was damaged and had to land here. And the people who okay, this is where we will, start our next,
Yeah.
a colony. And so everybody there was lousy with the Force because that's what it was. And so Azita Cruz was going to be the one girl in all of this homeworld that didn't have the Force, like
Mm.
that wasn't destined to be a Jedi, and what that meant as an ostracizing factor. And Lucasfilm Licensing was like, nope, that's not what that planet is. We're not following that little bit of canon. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'll find a different way for her to be different.
Mm.
They were very, very gracious in the things that I could do and the things that I could pitch, but they were like, we don't want any firsts and we don't want any lasts. So we don't want you to be establishing canon, and we don't want you to be, cauterizing paths of canon.
Mm.
But by all means, feel free to play within this, But the exercise of writing any corporate owned character is the you get to play with the toys and you put them back exactly as you found
Uh,
them.
now I can't have the thing. There's such a challenge to that because when you write a story, you write an arc, you want to develop a full character arc. But at the same
Mhm.
time, your arc though has parameters on there that are immovable. So how do you play? You said like in that toolbox, got to put everything back where you found it, but still want to tell a story that can live on its own, that can breathe on its own.
I mean, the the key for me is like, yes, I cannot change this character in a fundamental way,
Yeah.
but he could learn some stuff. It's the what's the lesson of the week? What's the lesson of the episode? What's the lesson of the miniseries? And settling on what that lesson was going to be, challenging some of Mace's pre-existing conceptions of what the world is, what the Force was, what his role in it was. All of that stuff was fair game. He was always going to be Mace Windu at the end of it,
Hmm.
but he is now Mace Windu who has a slightly different understanding of the world, um, which I think is how you kind of play in that zone of like, yeah, he's not getting married, he's not going to have any kids, he's not going to die, so he's not going to discover a Sith. Like,
Hmm.
there's stuff that you just can't do in canon at that point, but he could learn some stuff. He could discover some things about himself. He can be challenged on things that he believes.
Well, and the other thing that's kind of interesting and challenging too, I'm sure from a writing standpoint, is that when you're writing Mace Windu, you're you're not writing the Mace Windu we know because that's in the future of this story. You're writing a Mace Windu that has to be in some way different as he's younger, but has
Mhm.
to have all the components that you can see the dotted line and go, oh, now this is how he becomes Master Mace Windu. How hard is to find the right amount of Windu-ness to put into your character without losing the fact that he doesn't feel like Mace Windu.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge, but I remember I was having a conversation with somebody on a different project about design principles,
Mm,
and it's like, if you look at a whatever, let's call it a Mercedes Benz from 1985, it looks a certain way. If you look at a Mercedes Benz from 2025, it's a completely different car, but you can kind of see how it got there. Like,
okay.
there are still elements that remain. There are still design theories and design philosophies that have endured throughout that time. So it's figuring out what are the things about Mace that will always be, and then what are the things about Mace that will at some point be hammered out of him by experience. He's still a younger man, and who are younger men? They're somewhat impetuous and they're somewhat very firm in their beliefs. They haven't been challenged quite as much. They haven't, the cauldron of existence has not burned away some of the impurities of youth. And so, like, it's a thing that I think we've all encountered, especially anybody who's like, been friends with someone for a long time and then
Mhm.
discovers that that person now has children. And you're like, you're raising kids? Do you remember the you that used to be 20 years ago, who was like riding the top of cars like a surfboard? Like, the dumb stuff you did as a kid compared to the somewhat maturity of age. We all have a feeling of what that is. And so it was applying some of that. It was applying some of the like, all right, he's going to be this guy. So what kind of sort of trigonometry can we do to figure out who he used to be, what the experiences along the way might have led him to become, a person of order, a person of discipline, a person of very, very strict convictions in what he does, and the purity of the Jedi Council. Like, he's a believer. And
Mm.
so, who was a believer before they believed that much? What's the naivete of belief? He's a young priest, you know? So, not to say that he's ever going to wander from the path, but he's, I think, more questioning than he might have been as an older man.
Well, one thing you're talking about the idea of the following the path, a believer in the Jedi belief system. What I found interesting is in the beginning of the first issue, though, he does use the Force on Regum to pilot it was like the skiff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily a safe journey that he's about to go on. Is that an issue of ethics for someone like Mace Windu, or is that something that the older one would not have done?
I think the older one will have seen the errors of that, even though it's a thing that Obi-Wan gladly does as an older man. Um, but I think that also does speak to a little bit of the hypocrisy of the Jedi themselves, right? Which
Hmm.
is like we bond ourselves to a very strict ethic code, but we still do these things. We still force people to do things not of their own control.
Hmm.
We do engage in mind control. Like, is that an ethical practice? Probably not, but we do it. We teach it. Like,
Hmm.
we teach this to children. So there's always a little bit of moral gray area, I think, even when you're dealing in, even though only Sith deals in absolutes, there are still some things that, like, hey, doesn't that feel just absolutely wrong?
Yeah, 'cause I think the one thing I think you kind of felt a little bit of it in the prequels is that, especially towards Revenge of the Sith, you're seeing a Jedi Order that is morally question gray sometimes in how they're doing things. And when you're thinking about that as for Mace Windu and the Jedi Order as a whole, do you think that's something that's always been part of their order, or that's something as they started getting towards the Galactic Empire that started to break down a little bit, or maybe for desperation due to the Sith coming back, or just because that's just decay in a long-standing system?
um I mean, and this is just us kids talking, about nonsense, but if I had to put a incredibly impromptu finger on it, it feels like a combination of decay, of just sort of this weird encrusting of belief over
Hmm.
time that had gone unchallenged in a very big way, and then it gets challenged, and the challenge is what begins to reveal the cracks in the fabric of what the Jedi held dear and what they thought they believed and what they thought that they were. But I think that, like, anybody who looks at the Jedi Order and their tenets of faith and their codes of conduct would tell you, like, wait a minute, you're not going to let these people fall in love. You're not going to let these people engage in the
Hmm.
entirety of the human or, sentient life experience. That way lies madness. Of course, there are going to be people who rebel against that. Of course, there are going to be people who can't live up to that. And you've given them ungodly power. Like, maybe this is a recipe for disaster that has just been very, very slowly cooking, and it was going to take about 1,000 years to come to a boil. Like, a lot of that seems like bad idea from the jump. Um, so, like,
In your imagination with Mace Windu, maybe not necessarily in this part of his life in the story, but do you think Mace Windu is someone who does see those cracks, or is he blinded by his dedication to the order that he doesn't even realize some of the hypocrisies that are moving along the way? As we'll get to the quacks and formula as well, and their reaction to
mhm.
that. Does he see the hypocrisy yet, or is he just too young and green to maybe, or not have the wisdom to see, you know what, this isn't quite what we say we're doing?
Yeah, I don't know if he's there yet. I don't know if he's there yet. He's definitely, not to say that, like, he's drank the fruit punch as the kind of thing you'd want to apply to the Jedi Order. They are not a
Hmm.
cult, except they're totally a cult. Um, but he hasn't gone through it yet. And I even think the Mace you meet in Phantom Menace is still a guy who believes in Yoda,
Yeah.
and then is curious when he and Yoda have disagreements. Like, I am not sure if the Jedi are a organization that allows for healthy debate.
Hmm.
you know, um, to the point where, like, Qui-Gon has disagreements, and what does he do? He'll never be on the council. Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to be just tittering around the universe, finding new stuff to do, but I can't be this close to where the power lies because I don't agree with the way you guys wield this power.
Well, we think about, Yoda does have a good argument to make. He's 800 years old. It's hard to argue
He's seen some
800
shit.
years
He's
of
seen some
wisdom.
He's definitely seen some shit. But, in the same token, we at some point had to take my grandfather's keys away from him because he couldn't drive anymore.
Good point. Good
So, like, all of
point.
this wisdom, maybe the judgment's a little off.
Well, I think that's also something, once again, you look at as well with it with Azita Cruz and the Quacks, as I mentioned a little earlier, where Yoda basically tells Mace Windu, just get it. So should have it, go get it.
Mhm.
He doesn't. They're not very much into like the discussion about what is the morality of getting it. Why is this important? Why should we be involved as a guardian system with this this situation, which is both politics and economics, and a bunch of other stuff as well. Is that also a indication of the Jedi acting in a way that's more gray than pure?
I mean, I think that the Jedi are a weird. They're a weird bunch in that they are warrior priests. To like General Kenobi. Like, how do you suddenly have a military rank?
Yeah.
Like, out of did you go to like military college? Was there a basic training for you in terms of like, I get that you know how to use the Force, but do you understand troop displacements? Do you understand like the fact that that exists, that there are this weird melding of the military and the clerical, um, does imply a hierarchy, does imply a chain of command, and Yoda is clearly at the top of that chain of command. And so, like, when he says do a thing, do a thing.
Hmm.
Like, we don't necessarily have to have a big argument about it. I don't have to explain everything that we do. I do when I want to, and right now I don't want to. So just go get this stuff. Um, and Mace, as a young devotee, isn't going to be the guy to question it either. Like, A, he's outranked by 1,000 different levels, and B, he still believes. And so that whole that segment, the Yoda segment, is very much, the whole thing is a Bond story, at its structural core. And so you have your teaser opening where he's doing the thing with Regrump and we got to get the skeleton key, whatever, that bears no impact whatsoever on what happens next. He gets his new mission from M, which is Yoda, and Q, which is what's her face? I can't even remember her name. The female Jedi who's telling him where you're going, showing him the map,
Yeah.
whatever. And yeah, James Bond isn't asking questions about what he's going to do. He's an agent of Her Majesty's Secret Service, just
Hmm.
as Mace is an agent of the Jedi Order. Um, but I think that he can have, as occasionally in the good James Bond movies do, questions about the thing that he's doing. He'll discover stuff about it
Hmm.
along the way that not shakes his faith in it, but does make him, re-examine the path that he's on.
Is this something that this Jedi should be involved with? Because there is some safety issues. There is an issue of what happens if it does get in the wrong hands. Because it is if the exact teaches that it basically is like the super fuel that
Mm-hmm.
would definitely benefit any enemy that or pirates or whatever that's going to use it. So there is a safety issue. Is this something the Jedi should be taking upon themselves to get involved?
I think that the Jedi also are a bit like the Avengers, and that, like, we do this thing because nobody else can do this thing.
Hmm.
And granted, this does seem a bit small for them. Even Mace, I think there was a draft where Mace questions, like, really, we're getting involved in like local trade, disputes. But they're like, listen, it's a much bigger deal. Like, if somebody invents nitrous oxide and is putting it into cars and you can now outrun the police, like, that's a pretty big deal.
Hmm.
So we should kind of do, I know it's also an explosive. Okay, that's bad. So maybe we should step in and sort of nip this in the bud before it becomes a problem for everybody. The galactic peacekeeper part of the Jedi Order is sort of what's activated here.
So the character that does get introduced is Azita Cruz,
Mm-hmm.
who is she's interest. She's kind of like a smuggler. She's on her own. How much of her backstory are we gonna get from her? Are we gonna see more of like where she came from, how she got to where she is?
Um, a hair, a hair more of it. But I think issue two was very much about, like, issue one was, here are the stakes, here are the players. Issue two is, let's go a bit deeper in both of our sort of main protagonist and the quote unquote sidekick, and discover the differences between them and some of the common threads that they share. Um, and then issue three is, now that we've built this sort of pair bonded unit, now let's threaten it. Now let's bring the hammer down and see if we can cause it to fracture, or just disintegrate entirely. And so I think we'll get a little bit more of her story, and we'll get a little bit more of Mace's story as well. But then it's a bit of a sprint, I think, towards the finale. By the time you get to like the middle of issue 3, it's like, all right, and we're moving.
Well, I think the thing I think that I like a lot about Azita Cruz is that she brings up an interesting question to Mace that he responds to a little bit, but I feel like it's still the ramifications of it are quite significant. She asks him, did he volunteer to be a Jedi? Which the opposite answer is no. All Jedi are taken as or infants or young toddlers, I can't remember the exact age, and brought into Jedi's. So how does that question impact Mace? Why is that an important question that she's posing to him?
Um, I mean, I think that it's always important for me to find a way to say a thing about a thing. It's a story that's about nothing is just this weird hollow exercise of like, all right, well, we can make the pieces move and somebody will draw them very nicely, but like, are we saying anything about a thing? And so talking about responsibility, talking about child soldiers, talking about the belief or the sort of image of the Jedi Order as entirely beneficial and full of benefactors. Like, is it though? From the outside, it might not look that way. And I think that so often our perspective on the Jedi Order is from Jedi. Like they're the ones telling us their stories. And so to have somebody with a different experience of what that is, and a different perspective on it, I thought was kind of fun to then collide with somebody who is a young priest and say like, well, the Crusades, it's not all great. Okay, I know you took your vows and you believe and you've done the sacraments and now you carry the sword, but like, did you choose to do this? Like, were you sort of indoctrinated into it?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because what we mentioned a little earlier is that once again, a Jedi cannot marry, cannot have kids, cannot fall in love. That's quite a thing to force someone into. Hey, by the way, I'm stealing you from your family or whatever life you have, and this might have been a horrible analogy, and I'm going to apologize for the analogy for anyone listening. I was thinking almost like when you adopt a dog and you neuter it. You're like, the dog didn't ask to be adopted, nor did it ask to be neutered, but it's the decision you made for it. I feel like they did the same thing Mace Windu. You can't be married, you can't have kids, and we're not going to ask you if that's a decision you're really interested in going that way. Did you want to have a family? Not up to us. You're not. Don't worry about it. It's not happening for you.
Yeah, it's like you're a soldier in the Roman legions,
Yeah.
and like, oh yeah, your town had been sacked and all of the children are now slaves that are going to be trained to be soldiers. Like, did they choose any of this? No. Sure, that guy might grow up to be a general in that army and might have lots to thank for it, but he never chose it.
Right.
And so like choice, I feel, is a thing that's worth having a conversation about. Like, who gets to choose and who gets to choose for whom? And for as great as it might be on the other side of it, like, who might Mace Windu have been if he was not stolen from, or volunteered by his parents to
Yeah.
join the Jedi?
I gotta feel, and because it really does kind of also open the idea is with Azita Cruz and her idea of choice, is she then more free than he is?
I mean, she certainly thinks so. Like she goes where she wants, she does what she wants. I mean, the pressures on her are economic pressures. The pressures on her are sort of survivable questions like, how am I going to feed myself? How am I going to clothe myself? How am I going to shelter myself? And I do all of that through morally questionable activities. Um, but nobody's telling me what I can do or not do. Nobody's giving me a code of conduct I have to follow or ignore. And the freedom of choice is the thing that I have, but the security is not there. Mace does not have a freedom of choice, but the security is everywhere. Like he is profoundly secure in his own abilities. He 100% understands that, like, I'm going to get a spaceship and a lightsaber. They're going to clothe me. They're going to feed me. I got a home base to go back to. I got clothes I can, like, anything I could ever want, I have, but I can't choose any of it. And so these two people, kind of being forced together and to share space and to have to, relate with each other. The other thing that was a big inspiration for this story is Midnight Run. These two people who should not like each other and don't at the beginning, who come from completely different worlds, find some common ground between them as they're on the run from people trying to kill them. And so, like, how do you use the pressure, the external pressure of threats and bounty hunters and security guards and whatever, and boar worms to then just reveal these stories about two people who have very different perspectives on the world, both of which, are from the same place. Like how you start from the same place and end up completely different people. I thought was an interesting thing to talk about.
Well, when you think about again, Mace Windu, he's had on some level kind of a precious life, as you mentioned. Everything he needs, he has. Can he go from that place and understand where Azita Cruz is ever coming? Like, can he ever get himself to understand what it must be like to not know where my food's going to come from, what my needs are, not have an entire network supporting her as the way he does on some level?
I don't. I think there's a way for him to engage with empathy. Like I think that it's a thing that he has. It seems that he's shut down a little bit by the time he's on the council.
Hmm.
His empathy for Anakin is not extraordinarily deep. His empathy for Qui-Gon is like, well, we're brothers, but I don't understand this path you're on, and I'm not really looking to engage in it.
Hmm.
But I think sort of a younger man might be able to do like I'm on a Peace Corps mission. I'm empathetic for these people that I'm living with and I'm trying to support and trying to, build homes for. But I still get to go back to, Narragansett, and I still get to like hang out on
Right.
the Gold Coast, and I still get to, wear my Dockers and ride boats and shit. Um, so like I think that he, kind of empirically can understand her, even if emotionally he
Hmm.
can't sympathize with her that way, but definitely feels for her because I'm trying to be a good person in the universe, and a good person in the universe would have some feelings about your lot in life and what's driven you to be the person you are.
So the villains of the series are the Shroud. So what can you tell
Mm-hmm.
us about them and how do they connect to the overall themes of your story?
The Shroud, we meet two members of the Dusk Weavers, who they're like, Luddite terrorists, I suppose you could call them if you had to reduce it all the way down. But like they are people who do not believe that technology is the path to follow forward,
Hmm.
that it does nothing but ruin the world that it touches, that it does nothing but, harm everybody it comes into contact with. And coaxium ultra is just the latest in a long line of things that have been invented that do not make anything better, and in fact markedly will make them worse. And so their plan is to take it and the formula for it and use the enemy's weapons against them, and begin to just destroy all of the things that make the universe and the galaxy shine and go go go. And they are similar to the Jedi, like they're deep believers in this. They have a faith that, they have a calling that they have devoted their lives to. And so what happens when people, who conflicting theories about the universe come into conflict with one another? um Generally bad things happen.
Well, like I said, I really enjoyed the first two issues of Mace Windu. So how many issues is it slated to run?
It's 4 issues total. And when the trade comes out, I think, which is in June, middle of June, it'll also collect the 5-page story from the Revelations anthology. So it'll be all four plus the little. That's like the front end of the James Bond adventure. So to complete that whole little cycle.
Well, Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, sir. And I'm enjoying Mace Windu. And when does the next issue come out?
But I want to say it would be the first week in April. We seem to be the either the last weeks and months or the first weeks and months, and I think by April we get to like April 3rd or 4th.
All right, very cool. Thank you so much, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Have a great night.
Take it easy.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Divergent Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to turn for the next episode when Julian Riching boards the mothership. You know him as Death on Supernatural. Till next voyage, travel on.